When I saw my husband scrolling through my phone, my heart skipped a beat, but not out of fear of being caught. It was because I knew what he might find. The messages. The ones I should have deleted long ago. I lunged to grab the phone, but he pulled it back effortlessly, his thumb still flicking through the screen. I watched his face change with every line he read, and I felt my life cracking apart, second by second. Yes, he was about to find out. But not everything. Not the whole truth. His hands began to tremble as he scrolled deeper, and I realized he was closing in on the one message that could destroy me. The one that would explain too much, or nothing at all. Then, suddenly, the phone vibrated in his grip. A new notification flashed across the screen. I saw the name. So did he. His face turned pale. He froze. Didn't even blink. I bit the inside of my cheek, an old habit when I panic. My nerves tangled with the horror of what I had done. I could hear his breathing change, rapid and shallow, even from 2 meters away. This was the moment I had feared most. Because 3 months ago, I made a mistake. A mistake that unraveled everything. And now, I wasn't sure what would come next. But let me tell you what really happened. Before I share the secret I've been hiding so carefully, tell me in the comments where you're watching from, and answer this. Have you ever kept a secret so big that it nearly destroyed everything when the truth finally came out? I didn't wake up that morning thinking I'd start lying to my husband. The thought didn't even cross my mind as I brushed my hair, ironed my blouse, and sipped the same brand of coffee I'd bought for the past decade. My routine was stable. Predictable. Maybe that was part of the problem. He was already in the kitchen when I came down. Eyes on his tablet, fingers tapping through emails, lips barely moving as he said, "Morning." I said it back, automatically. The way you do when you've said it 1,000 times, and it means nothing anymore. I watched him for a moment. Same white shirt. Same watch. Same scent. There was nothing wrong with him. But somehow, everything felt off. My phone buzzed. A message. Just a reminder about the staff meeting, but it gave me a reason to look away. To mentally step out of the house before I had even left it. I drove to work with the radio off. My thoughts louder than any music. I kept thinking about how empty our conversations had become. How we existed in the same space but lived entirely different lives. Not enemies, not lovers, just placeholders in each other's routines. There was no fight. No drama. Just quiet, numbing distance. At the office, I stepped into the elevator and pressed the button for the 7th floor. As the doors slid shut, I caught my reflection. I looked tired. Not in a didn't sleep well kind of way, in a haven't felt alive in months kind of way. My skin was flawless, makeup applied like muscle memory. But the light in my eyes? Gone. Then he walked in. He wasn't supposed to be there yet. My nephew, the one I'd agreed to help. A recent graduate, full of ambition and completely unsure of himself. I'd promised his mother I'd give him a chance. And I meant it. But I didn't expect him to be there so early. Or to look like that, eyes alert, posture nervous but hopeful. He smiled when he saw me. "Didn't think I'd beat you in," he said. I smiled back, pretending it was just another Monday. First time for everything. We walked down the hall together. I showed him the corner desk I'd arranged, introduced him to a few team members, and gave him access to a few internal folders. He nodded eagerly, taking mental notes. But every time he glanced my way, I felt something stir. Not attraction, not yet. Just awareness. That someone saw me. Not as his aunt. Not as a wife. But as a person. By noon, we were buried in spreadsheets. He asked thoughtful questions. He worked hard. He even made a joke that caught me off guard, and I laughed. Really laughed. I couldn't remember the last time I'd done that at work. When I went to the break room to grab coffee, he followed, holding a report he wanted to discuss. We stood side by side, talking numbers. I pointed at something on the page, and for a second, our hands touched. Just lightly. But the warmth lingered. I pretended not to notice. He did the same. That evening, I got home before my husband. The house was clean. Silent. I walked into the kitchen, poured myself a glass of wine, and leaned against the counter. The glass felt cold in my hand. My phone buzzed, a thank you text from my nephew. I read it twice. It wasn't inappropriate. It was polite. Grateful. But there was something in the way he'd phrased it. I appreciate you more than you know. I didn't reply. My husband came in around 9. He kissed my cheek out of habit. We ate dinner quietly. He talked about quarterly reports, new policies, a conference he might attend next month. I nodded, asked the expected questions. My smile was practiced. Every word I said was rehearsed. Later, as I lay beside him in bed, his back turned to me, I stared at the ceiling and wondered if he'd notice if I'd just vanished. Not literally. Just emotionally. I wondered if he already had. I didn't sleep well that night. I kept thinking about work. About how alive I'd felt. About that brief moment in the break room. Not because I wanted it to happen again. But because I remembered what it felt like to be noticed. The next morning, my husband handed me coffee with a distracted "Here you go." I thanked him. He didn't respond. Just went back to his screen. I drank it in silence, the taste bitter. At work, my nephew was already there. Early again. He looked up, smiled. Morning. I smiled back. And in that moment, I made the first of many decisions I'd later regret. I decided not to mention anything to my husband about how late I'd be staying that night. I told myself it was for work. And at the time, maybe it was. The days that followed blurred together, though I remember the quiet intensity of each moment. There was nothing overtly wrong, no scandalous gesture, no grand betrayal, at least not yet. But under the surface, something shifted. It was subtle, like the change in air before a storm. I could feel it building. And yet I did nothing to stop it. He was always early. Earlier than expected. He never said why, and I never asked. Perhaps we both preferred to pretend it was dedication. And maybe that's what it was, for a while. But the way he looked at me lingered longer than necessary. Not inappropriate, not yet. Just enough to remind me that I was seen. Not professionally. Not respectfully. Seen as a woman. One morning, I brought in coffee for both of us. It wasn't a conscious choice, I just happened to pass the cafe downstairs, and something compelled me to order too. When I handed him the cup, his smile was so sincere it almost made me recoil. Gratitude in its purest form can be disarming. He took it carefully, as if the gesture meant more than it should have. Maybe it did. We worked side by side most of the day. A major proposal was coming due, and he had been helping me prepare the financial projections. He was precise, curious, quick to learn. The kind of support I hadn't experienced in years. At home, support came with conditions, timelines, compromises, trade-offs. Here, it was given freely, even eagerly. Late in the afternoon, I noticed the way the light fell across his face while he leaned over his keyboard. The angle made him look older, more serious. I caught myself staring. I told myself it was admiration, professional, distant, appropriate. But something deeper stirred. Not attraction. Not yet. But something adjacent to it. A warmth I hadn't felt in a long time. As we finalized the draft, we sat closely together, eyes on the same screen. I reached to scroll, and our hands brushed again. Neither of us pulled away immediately. It was only a second, but it pulsed with awareness. He glanced sideways, lips parting as if to say something, but then stopped. I didn't acknowledge it. I just kept typing. At home that night, I prepared dinner as usual. My husband walked in, hung up his coat, and muttered a hello. I responded. He didn't ask about my day. I didn't offer. We ate in silence, television murmuring in the background. The clinking of silverware felt louder than it should have. I wondered if he noticed I wasn't wearing the necklace he bought me for our anniversary. I doubted it. Later, while folding laundry, I noticed one of his shirts smelled faintly floral, too fragrant to be a detergent scent. Something vaguely feminine. It wasn't enough to accuse, not enough to ask. But it was enough to store in the back of my mind, with the growing collection of small, unspoken doubts. The following morning, I stood longer than necessary in front of my closet. My usual navy blouse didn't feel right. I chose a soft ivory one instead, slightly fitted, nothing scandalous, but different. As I buttoned it, I looked in the mirror. I didn't look younger. But I looked sharper. More awake. At the office, he noticed. "You look nice today," he said. I offered a smile, brief and restrained. "Thanks." That was all. Just a word. But something changed in the air between us. We spent the day reviewing the pitch deck. I found myself laughing more than usual. His jokes were subtle, clever. He had a dry wit that came out in quiet bursts. It wasn't flirtatious, at least not obviously. But there was comfort in our exchanges, a rhythm that had grown more natural, more personal. Around 5, most of the office emptied. The lights dimmed automatically, as they always did at sunset. We were still at the conference table, finishing revisions. He leaned back, stretching. I stood to gather our notes. When I bent slightly to reach a file, I felt his eyes on me. I didn't look up, didn't comment. But I knew. "We should probably call it a night," I said. He nodded. "Yeah. Sorry for keeping you." "You didn't." We walked to the elevator in silence. The ride down was slow, filled with an awareness that neither of us voiced. When the doors opened, I stepped out first. We paused in the lobby. I turned to say goodbye. He did too. And then, we kissed. It was brief. Barely a moment. But it happened. I stepped back immediately, as if the air itself had shocked me. He started, but stopped. "I have to go," I said. My voice was flat. Controlled. He didn't follow. He just nodded. Outside, the cold hit me harder than I expected. I walked to my car quickly, heart thudding in a slow, uneven rhythm. My fingers shook as I turned the key. I didn't cry. I didn't scream. I just sat there, breathing, until the windshield began to fog. I didn't sleep well that night. I lay in bed next to my husband, his back to me, the space between us wider than usual. He didn't reach for me. He hadn't in weeks. Maybe months. I stared at the ceiling and tried to make sense of what I'd done. It wasn't love. It wasn't passion. But it was something. A rupture. A crack in the surface of everything I had spent years trying to preserve. I told myself it was nothing. A lapse. A momentary confusion. I would handle it. I would fix it. But as I closed my eyes, I knew I had already crossed a line. And I wasn't sure I wanted to step back. I arrived at the office the next morning far earlier than usual, hoping the quiet would grant me clarity. The sky was still a dark gray, the building hollow, the echo of my heels the only sound as I walked through the corridor. My thoughts were like smoke, thick, formless, impossible to grasp. I had rehearsed what I might say if I saw him. I'd thought of ways to excuse the moment, to rewrite it as nothing. But none of it felt right. And I didn't yet know if I wanted it to. By the time he arrived, I was already at my desk, pretending to work, though I'd reread the same line on the screen 5 times. When the elevator dinged and I heard his familiar steps approach, my pulse quickened, not from fear, but from something more complicated. Anticipation, perhaps. Guilt. Confusion. He paused when he saw me, and I could feel the weight of his glance before I even lifted my eyes. We said nothing. He gave a short nod, a polite gesture we hadn't used before, and settled into his space. The air felt thin, dense with unspoken things. The day passed slowly. We avoided being alone in the same room. When conversation was necessary, it was brief, restrained. We clung to professionalism like a shield, and it worked, for a while. But tension clung to the edges of everything we said, every silence between us. I caught him looking at me more than once, and I know he saw me looking back. Each time we looked away just as quickly. At lunch, I went out alone. I needed to walk, to breathe. I wandered to the cafe 2 blocks down, ordered something I didn't want, and sat by the window watching people live lives that didn't look like mine. Couples talking, friends laughing, people typing with purpose. I envied them, if only for their clarity. I had once believed my life was clear too. Predictable, structured, controlled. But the older I became, the more that structure felt like confinement. And now, after just one decision, one moment, I was outside the walls I'd spent decades building. When I returned, there was a message on my desk. A sticky note, written in pen. It said only, "Thank you for yesterday." I'm sorry. No name, but it didn't need one. I read it 3 times before tucking it into the back of my planner. I didn't throw it away. I told myself I would, eventually. But not yet. The rest of the day passed uneventfully, at least on the surface. But something shifted in me. A quiet dislodging of the internal weight I had carried for so long. I began to see things I had trained myself not to notice. The way my husband rarely called during the day, unless something was urgent. How he had slowly stopped asking when I'd be home. How we no longer made plans together unless one of us had a reason. These weren't crimes. They weren't betrayals. They were something more invisible, erosion. That night at home, I tried to bridge the distance. I made dinner, lit candles, even opened a bottle of wine. He arrived later than usual and barely looked up when he walked in. I gestured toward the dining table, smiling as naturally as I could. He looked at the setup, then at me, and asked, "What's the occasion?" I lied. Just felt like doing something nice. He nodded absently and sat down. We ate in silence for several minutes before he asked, "Everything okay at work?" The question caught me off guard. Not because of the words, but because of the timing. I hesitated. "Yes," I said. "Just busy." He didn't look up. Good. I waited for him to ask something else. He didn't. Instead, he changed the topic, some issue with the car, a noise it was making. I responded politely, like a colleague. The moment I had tried to create, the one I had hoped would reconnect us, drifted away, unnoticed. Later, while he watched television in the living room, I washed dishes slowly, methodically. My mind kept drifting back to the sticky note. His handwriting. The sincerity behind the apology. I didn't know what it meant, or what I wanted it to mean. But it stayed with me. The next morning, I wore the necklace he had given me last year. A small gesture, maybe even passive. A way to remind myself that I was still his wife, that my life had not completely changed. At the office, I kept things distant. I assigned him a task that didn't require direct collaboration. I checked in via email instead of face-to-face. We were both cautious, like people stepping around broken glass. But avoidance doesn't erase reality. It only delays it. Around mid-afternoon, he came into my office to clarify a data point. His voice was calm, steady. He didn't mention the note. He didn't allude to anything. But when he handed me the document, our fingers touched again, briefly, accidentally. I flinched. He didn't. When he left, I stared at the paper for several minutes before realizing I hadn't even read it. My thoughts were spiraling again. Not with fantasies, but with questions. Was this an ending? A beginning? Or something worse, something undefined? That evening, my husband was on a conference call when I came home. He waved a hand toward me without pausing his conversation. I walked past him, dropped my bag, and sat at the edge of the bed for a long time, staring at nothing. I thought about telling him. About admitting that something had happened. That something was happening. But I didn't. Not because I wanted to lie. Because I didn't know how to tell the truth, not when the truth was still forming itself inside me. I ate dinner alone. He joined me later, eating quickly, glancing at his phone between bites. At one point, he laughed at something on the screen. I looked at him, searching for the man I had married. He looked back and smiled, but the smile didn't reach his eyes. I mirrored it anyway. That night, in bed, I lay awake long after he began to snore. I thought about the moment in the elevator. The way it had happened without thought. The way I hadn't planned it, and yet hadn't resisted. I thought about the apology. About the way he had stayed quiet, respectful, distant. He hadn't pursued anything. But he hadn't ignored it either. I tried to picture what would happen next. I couldn't. And that uncertainty, that inability to see the road ahead, frightened me more than anything. But beneath the fear, beneath the confusion, there was something else. Curiosity. Not about him. About myself. I didn't know who I was becoming. But I wasn't sure I wanted to go back. The day started with silence. Not just the usual domestic quiet that had become normal between us, but a heavier kind. The kind that filled the air with something unnamed. My husband was already gone by the time I came down to the kitchen, a half-empty coffee cup still warm on the counter, his toast untouched. No note. No message. Just absence. I stood there longer than necessary, staring at the cup like it held answers. It didn't. I rinsed it out, wiped the counter, and left for work earlier than usual. The streets were still sleepy, bathed in soft light. I parked further from the office than normal, just to walk a little. Clear my thoughts. Focus. But nothing cleared. I kept circling the same thoughts, as if hoping repetition would somehow bring understanding. At work, everything appeared normal. People moving through corridors, keyboards clicking, polite greetings exchanged without meaning. I smiled when I had to, nodded when expected. My nephew arrived precisely on time, avoiding my eyes, speaking to me only when necessary. It was as though we had signed a silent agreement to erase what had happened. But memory doesn't vanish on command. It clings. We had a meeting that afternoon with a new client, one that mattered more than usual. The proposal was his first major assignment under my guidance. He had worked hard, even stayed late most nights refining the presentation. I watched him in the conference room as he set up, his expression focused, controlled. The same boy I'd welcomed into my professional space weeks ago now stood taller, more confident. I felt pride. And guilt. In equal measure. During the presentation, I noticed the client watching me as much as him. At first, I thought I was imagining it. Then I caught her glancing between us, her mouth pursed, brows slightly raised. I redirected my attention, answered her questions sharply, and kept my tone crisp. But the discomfort grew. Perception was everything in this industry. Even the suggestion of impropriety could cause damage. After the meeting, I thanked him for his work and returned to my office without comment. I closed the door, exhaled slowly, and sat for several minutes without touching my keyboard. My heart was still racing. Not from the meeting itself, but from the way it exposed the fragility of the boundary I was trying to restore. We had been too close. Too natural. And people noticed. Later that evening, most of the office had cleared out. I stayed behind, not because of the workload, but because I didn't want to go home. There was no conversation waiting for me there. No real presence. Just silence in a different setting. I stared at the spreadsheet on my screen, but the numbers meant nothing. I kept thinking about the moment the client looked at me. How quickly suspicion could build from nothing more than a glance. I didn't hear him approach. The knock was gentle, followed by the door creaking open slightly. "Do you need anything before I leave?" I turned. His expression was unreadable, but his voice was calm. Neutral. As if we had never crossed that line. As if he hadn't written me a note. As if we hadn't shared a moment that rewrote something fundamental between us. I shook my head. No. Thanks. Get some rest. He hesitated for half a second, then nodded. Good night. The door clicked softly behind him. I sat still, my back straight, my hands in my lap. My reflection in the darkened screen looked like a stranger. There was no passion in my expression. No longing. Just fatigue. Emotional, not physical. I gathered my things slowly and left just before the cleaning staff arrived. The drive home was quiet, the streets dimly lit, familiar. My neighborhood looked the same as always, manicured lawns, porch lights glowing like watchful eyes. Inside, the house was dark except for the television's flickering light in the living room. My husband was there, half asleep, a half-finished drink on the table beside him. He stirred when I entered but didn't speak. I didn't either. I changed into more comfortable clothes and returned to the kitchen. I stood by the refrigerator with the door open, staring blankly. I wasn't hungry. I just didn't want to sit in that room. Eventually, I poured myself a glass of water and leaned against the counter. He walked in, rubbing his eyes. "You're home late," he said, voice hoarse. "Meeting ran long," I replied. It wasn't a lie. Not exactly. He nodded, opened the fridge behind me, pulled out the bottle, and poured himself another drink. The clink of glass against the counter filled the space where conversation should have been. "I might have to travel next week," he said. "Chicago or Denver?" I didn't ask which. I didn't ask why. I just nodded. Okay. He didn't elaborate. I wondered if there was another reason for the trip. I didn't care enough to ask, and that realization stung more than it should have. Later, lying in bed beside him, I thought about the life we used to share. Not just the routines or the obligations, but the closeness. The intimacy. The way we used to talk in the dark, about everything and nothing. That had disappeared slowly, so quietly we hadn't even noticed it fading. And now, even when we lay within inches of each other, we were miles apart. I turned onto my side, facing away from him. My phone buzzed once. A calendar reminder. I had forgotten that we were supposed to have dinner with another couple the following weekend. I dismissed the alert without hesitation. The idea of pretending felt exhausting. The next day at work, I stayed reserved. Professional. Controlled. I kept conversations brief, instructions clear. But I felt him watching me, waiting for some acknowledgement. I didn't give it. Not because I was angry, but because I didn't trust myself. A part of me wanted to undo everything. Another part didn't regret it at all. Around mid-afternoon, he left the building briefly, then returned with 2 coffees. He set one on my desk without a word. I stared at it for several minutes. Then I picked it up, took a sip, and continued working. We didn't speak the rest of the day. By the time Friday arrived, I was exhausted. Not from the hours or the work, but from the constant restraint. Every word, every glance, every gesture had to be calculated. It was like living in a glass box, aware that every move could shatter the illusion of normalcy. That evening, my husband brought home takeout. He handed me the bag without comment and turned on the television. We ate from the containers in silence. I watched him, trying to remember how it had once felt to be excited by his presence. Nothing stirred. After dinner, he asked if I wanted to watch a movie. I said no. I retreated upstairs, claiming a headache. In truth, I just needed to be alone. In the quiet of our bedroom, I sat at the edge of the bed and pulled out my planner. The note was still there, tucked between pages. I read it again. Just 7 words. But they spoke more truth than anything my husband had said in weeks. I didn't know what to do. I didn't have a plan. But I knew one thing with absolute clarity. Something in my life had shifted. And it wasn't going to shift back. The weekend passed in a blur of quiet moments and carefully avoided conversations. My husband spent most of his time in his home office, taking calls, responding to emails, and mumbling vague updates about his upcoming trip. I kept to myself, floating between rooms, completing small tasks that didn't require concentration. I folded laundry that had already been folded. Reorganized drawers that didn't need reorganizing. There was something soothing about the repetition, as if I could scrub my thoughts clean by tidying the corners of my physical world. On Sunday night, we sat across from each other at the dinner table. The clinking of silverware echoed in the silence. We didn't look at each other. I wanted to ask him where he really went on Thursday, when he said he was out with a colleague. I wanted to ask why he didn't touch me anymore, or notice when I did something different with my hair. But I said nothing. The questions sat on the tip of my tongue, heavy but unsaid. I chewed slowly, listening to the sound of my own breath. That night, in bed, he rolled over and placed a hand on my hip. I froze. It wasn't desire that paralyzed me, it was the unfamiliarity. It had been so long since he'd touched me with any purpose. His fingers lingered, then withdrew. He didn't say a word. Neither did I. When his breathing settled into the slow rhythm of sleep, I remained still, staring at the ceiling. The space between us had never felt wider, even with his body just inches from mine. Monday brought with it the illusion of normalcy. I dressed carefully that morning, choosing a dark green blouse that hugged just enough to remind me I still had a figure worth noticing. It wasn't vanity. It was preservation. I needed to remember who I was outside the roles I'd been trapped in. At work, I greeted my team with the same calm professionalism I had maintained all week. But I could feel the undercurrent beneath it: tension, anticipation, restraint. He arrived just after I did, wearing a crisp shirt and holding a fresh coffee in his hand. He met my eyes for only a moment before settling into his usual place. We worked in parallel all morning, the proximity both familiar and fraught. There was a heaviness to the silence that lingered between us. Every small gesture felt amplified, the way I passed him a document, the way his fingers brushed mine when taking it. None of it meant anything, not explicitly. But all of it meant something. Around noon, I suggested we review the client revisions in the main conference room. It was neutral ground, a public space, somewhere we could focus without the closeness of our shared desk area. He agreed with a short nod. We gathered the necessary files and settled at the long table, sunlight streaming through the wide windows, casting clean lines across the polished surface. We spoke minimally, reviewing slides and financial summaries. Occasionally, he offered a suggestion, and I adjusted the file accordingly. We were a good team, focused, efficient. But beneath the numbers and bullet points, I could feel the tension building again. Not in words. In glances. In the way his voice hesitated at the start of a sentence. In the way I avoided looking at his mouth when he spoke. At some point, the room grew too warm. Or maybe it was just me. I stood to stretch, walking toward the window, letting the breeze from the barely open panel touch my face. When I turned back, he was watching me, not staring, but not casual either. Our eyes met and held, and in that second, the unspoken weight of everything passed between us. There were no words. There didn't need to be. When we resumed working, something in the air had changed. We were both more careful. More deliberate. He leaned away slightly when passing me notes. I kept my voice flatter, clipped. We were building walls as fast as we could, but the foundation underneath was already cracked. By late afternoon, the office began to thin out. People packed bags, said quiet goodbyes, and drifted toward elevators. I didn't move. Neither did he. I told myself we had more to finish, that staying was about productivity. But when the last employee waved goodnight and the door clicked shut behind her, I realized I had lied to myself again. We sat in silence for a few minutes, the glow of our screens the only light in the room. Finally, he spoke, his voice soft but clear. I didn't mean to make things complicated. I looked at him, startled by the directness. I wanted to respond, to reassure him, or to correct him, but no words came. I respect you, he continued, his eyes steady. That's why I haven't said anything. I wanted you to know that. I nodded, not because I agreed or disagreed, but because it was the only thing I could do. The silence returned. Not awkward, just present. I closed my laptop, stood up slowly, and began to gather my things. He did the same, quietly, without rushing. As we stepped into the elevator, the stillness between us settled again, heavier this time. I stared at the floor numbers ticking down, my breath shallow. And then it happened. We kissed. It was quiet. Brief. No words followed. No explanation. When the elevator doors opened on the ground floor, we stepped out, separate. We didn't look at each other again. Outside, the sky was darkening. The breeze had a chill to it. I walked to my car without turning around, unlocking the door with a trembling hand. Inside, I sat still for several minutes, the engine silent. I couldn't decide if I felt more ashamed or more alive. That night, I entered the house like a shadow. My husband was already asleep. The television still flickered in the background. I turned it off, careful not to wake him, and made my way upstairs. In the bathroom, I stared at my reflection. My face looked calm, but my eyes betrayed me. There was a storm behind them, quiet but unmistakable. I washed my hands slowly, then pressed my palms to the counter, grounding myself. I didn't know what tomorrow would bring. But I knew I had crossed another line. Quietly. Deliberately. And I wasn't sure I wanted to go back. The next morning felt heavier than the rest. It wasn't because of a lack of sleep, though I hadn't truly rested, but because of what had accumulated inside me. Guilt no longer came in sharp pangs. It settled more like dust. Quiet. Persistent. And the more I tried to ignore it, the more it seemed to coat everything I touched. I went through the motions as always, shower, makeup, coffee, but each step felt automated, as though I was following someone else's routine. At work, everything functioned on the surface. My meetings stayed on time. Emails were answered. Reports reviewed. But the atmosphere between us had undeniably changed. I didn't look at him when I entered the office that morning, nor did he try to speak to me. We became two bodies in the same space again, but this time it wasn't professionalism that kept us apart. It was self-preservation. The rest of the team didn't seem to notice the shift. If they did, they didn't say anything. That was the dangerous part about adult life, how easy it became to hide emotional chaos beneath schedules and spreadsheets. I moved through the day like a shadow of myself, hyper-aware of every interaction but unable to alter any of them. The previous evening's moment in the elevator haunted me, not for what it was, but for what it confirmed. That night, at home, I found my husband on the back patio, talking on his phone. He was laughing, something I hadn't heard in a while. The tone was casual, relaxed. When he noticed me through the glass door, his expression flickered, but only slightly. He wrapped up the call quickly, told whoever it was that he'd get back to them tomorrow. I didn't ask who it was. I didn't want to know. We had dinner, barely speaking. I mentioned something about a project going well. He nodded, seemed distracted. When I asked about his trip, he said it was still being finalized. The answers were vague, practiced. We weren't fighting. But we weren't connecting either. That was the hardest part, there was no clear villain in this story. Just two people slowly becoming strangers in their own home. As we cleared the dishes, he made a passing comment, "You've been working late a lot." It wasn't an accusation. But it wasn't nothing either. I shrugged, told him things had picked up. He didn't push. He didn't say he missed me. He didn't ask if everything was okay. He simply accepted the distance as fact and turned back toward his emails. The following day, a strange tension hovered in the office, not from him, but from outside. One of our team members, a junior associate, kept glancing between us. At first, I thought I imagined it. But then I caught her hesitating outside my office, clearly about to say something before changing her mind. I knew that look. The look people give when they're connecting dots that weren't meant to be connected. I tried to dismiss it. But the reality was beginning to show in places I couldn't control. Perception was dangerous in environments like ours. It didn't matter what actually happened, what mattered was what people believed. The office was a web of small talk and silent observations. And I had given them enough to speculate on, even if unintentionally. That evening, as I was packing up to leave, my phone buzzed with a message from him. Not a text, just a single-word subject line in an email, "Sorry." I didn't open it. I didn't delete it either. I just let it sit in my inbox, a silent reminder that this wasn't as contained as I'd told myself it was. On the drive home, I kept thinking about the woman in the office hallway. How quickly curiosity turns to gossip. How rumors have a way of finding their shape without ever needing proof. And how, once released, they rarely disappear. When I pulled into the driveway, our neighbor was out watering her plants. She waved, cheerful as always, but her eyes lingered on me a second too long. I waved back, managing a polite smile. It was nothing. Probably nothing. But it stayed with me. Inside the house, everything was exactly where I'd left it. My husband wasn't home yet. I dropped my bag on the table, poured a glass of water, and stood in the kitchen until the silence felt too loud. I went upstairs, changed clothes, and lay across the bed, staring at the ceiling again. The ceiling had become my nightly companion. Steady. Blank. Unchanging. Around 9, I heard the door open. He greeted me from downstairs, his voice casual. I didn't respond right away. I listened to his movements, the keys hitting the counter, the rustling of a jacket, the low murmur of him talking to himself as he navigated the kitchen. I waited for him to come up, to say something. He didn't. Later, I passed by the hallway where he was watching TV. He looked up briefly and asked, "You okay?" I nodded. "Just tired." He nodded back. "Same." And that was it. The next morning, I arrived at the office to find a small envelope on my desk. My name was written on the front in his handwriting. I hesitated before opening it. Inside was a note, short, careful. "I think we should keep our distance. It's not fair to either of us. Thank you for everything." No greeting. No goodbye. Just clarity. For a moment, I sat with the paper in my hands, reading the same sentence over and over. My chest tightened, not from heartbreak, but from something murkier. Relief. Sadness. Resentment. Loss. All layered on top of one another. I folded the note neatly and placed it in the back of my drawer, alongside the first one he had left me weeks ago. I didn't know why I kept them. Maybe because they were the only honest words I'd received in a long time. The day passed in silence between us. No casual glances. No shared tasks. We functioned like strangers in parallel tracks. It was what I had wanted. What I had told myself was necessary. But it felt more like grief than resolution. That evening, I returned home to find my husband already there. He'd made dinner, a rare gesture. He poured me a glass of wine, told me he had confirmed his trip, and would be gone for 4 days. I asked where. He said Chicago. I didn't ask who he was meeting. I didn't ask if he'd be alone. We ate quietly, the occasional clang of cutlery breaking the silence. He looked tired. Older. I wondered if he saw the same in me. After dinner, he stood near the sink, wiping his hands on a towel, and said, "I've been thinking. Maybe we should take some time. A weekend. Just us." I blinked. It wasn't what I expected. He added, "I know we've both been distracted." I stared at him for a long moment. There was no accusation in his voice. No affection, either. Just the suggestion of a truce between two people who weren't sure they still recognized each other. I nodded slowly. Maybe. He didn't push. Just nodded back and walked out of the room. I remained at the table for a long while after he left. The wine had grown warm. The house was silent. But for the first time in weeks, I realized something had shifted, not between me and my husband, or me and him, but within myself. I was no longer afraid of the silence. I had simply become part of it. The morning of the conference was colder than I expected. A fine mist clung to the windows as I packed my overnight bag with mechanical precision, folding each item deliberately, almost ritualistically. My husband had left early for his flight to Chicago, leaving only a brief note on the counter reminding me to take care of things while he was gone. I didn't know if he meant the house, the job, or myself. I didn't ask. I had no one to ask. The event had been planned for weeks, a regional leadership summit hosted by one of our firm's partner organizations. I had attended similar ones before, always routine, always predictable. This time, it felt different. Not because of the agenda or the location, but because I wasn't the same person walking into it. We arrived separately. He was already in the lobby when I stepped inside, dressed neatly, focused on his phone. He looked up when I approached, nodded with polite detachment, and held the elevator without speaking. I followed him in. We didn't exchange words. We didn't need to. There was nothing left to say that hadn't already been communicated in the silences we'd shared for weeks. The hotel room I had been assigned was clean and impersonal, as they always were, neutral-colored walls, a bed too stiff, a window with a view of the parking lot. I set my bag down carefully and sat at the edge of the bed, staring at the television without turning it on. The agenda booklet sat on the desk, neatly printed and color-coded. I opened it, traced the sessions with my finger, and realized I didn't care about any of them. That afternoon's schedule included a series of workshops and team-building panels. I attended one. Sat through the second. Took notes I wouldn't read again. He was in the same room for both, seated several chairs away. He didn't look at me. I didn't look at him. But I knew he was there. I could feel it. By the time the sun began to set, the conference hall had thinned out. People filtered toward their rooms, some to prepare for the evening reception, others to escape the forced smiles and stiff handshakes. I lingered by the water table, sipping slowly, pretending to read my phone. He passed me once, just once, and didn't pause. Later that evening, dressed for the dinner gathering downstairs, I stood in front of the mirror and adjusted my neckline twice, then a third time. Not for elegance. Not for seduction. For control. I didn't know what I wanted to project, poise, perhaps. Detachment. A version of myself who hadn't been shaken by the last month. The reception was held in a softly lit ballroom, small enough to feel intimate but large enough to keep your distance. Waitstaff moved silently between guests with glasses of wine and trays of hors d'oeuvres. Laughter punctuated the hum of background music, the kind of laughter reserved for networking, friendly, false, practiced. I saw him standing across the room in conversation with another attendee, his expression calm, composed. He glanced at me once. Briefly. I didn't smile. I didn't move. I don't remember how long I stayed. I know I talked to 2 or 3 people. I know someone asked me about a promotion I hadn't applied for. I know someone else complimented my presentation from last quarter. I responded politely, laughed when expected, and excused myself early. Back in the hallway, the air was quieter. Cooler. I pressed the elevator button and waited. When the doors opened, I stepped inside, and he was already there. Alone. We stood on opposite sides of the space, facing forward. Neither of us spoke. The numbers ticked upward, floor by floor. When we reached mine, I stepped out. And he followed. We spent the night together. There was no conversation. No promise. No explanation. Just presence. Not lust, not romance, something softer, more fragile. A shared surrender to something that had been building between us for far too long. In the morning, I woke before dawn. He was already gone. The room was still, the bedding disturbed only slightly. I sat up slowly, staring at the empty space beside me. There was no note. No message. Just absence. I dressed quietly and packed without rushing. The hotel hallways were silent, carpeted in the hush of early morning departure. Downstairs, the lobby was empty except for a single concierge yawning behind the desk. I didn't check out. The firm had already covered it. Driving home, the roads felt unfamiliar, even though I knew them well. The landscape blurred outside the window, and I realized I couldn't remember a single detail from the drive there. I wasn't sure if I had slept or simply shut my eyes to everything around me. Back at the house, I walked into a space that felt both mine and not mine. The same smell. The same furniture. But I was different. I didn't rush to unpack. I didn't change clothes. I sat at the dining table with my coat still on, staring at the fruit bowl in the center, apples beginning to soften at the edges, a banana browning quietly. Later, I wandered into the bedroom and found my husband's suitcase already there, open, clothes neatly folded. He was back. His absence, as usual, hadn't been long enough to change anything. He walked in behind me a few minutes later, phone in hand. When he saw me, he paused, then said, "You're back early." I nodded. It ended early. He nodded too. We stood in the same room, neither of us moving. There was no kiss hello. No hug. Just a quiet assessment of each other's presence. "Everything okay?" he asked. "Yes," I said. "Just tired." He walked past me, placed his phone on the dresser, and sat on the edge of the bed to remove his shoes. I watched him for a moment, his movements slow, routine. I wondered if he noticed the difference in me. If he sensed the distance, or if he'd grown so used to it that it felt normal. I left the room without another word and went downstairs. I needed noise. I turned on the television, not watching, just letting the voices fill the space. I folded a blanket that didn't need folding. I cleaned an already clean counter. I tried not to think about the night before. But the silence only amplified it. There was no regret. But there was a heaviness I couldn't name. Something irreversible had happened. And yet, somehow, life around me continued exactly the same. Monday arrived quietly, slipping into my life without fanfare. There was no dramatic shift in weather, no symbolic moment to mark the turning of some internal tide. The sky was as it always was, those pale and indifferent, and I moved through the morning like a sleepwalker, clinging to routine as though it might hold me together. He didn't speak much as he got ready for work. I didn't either. We passed each other in the hallway and exchanged brief nods, almost like polite strangers in a shared apartment. I watched him pour his coffee, the same way he had for years. 1 sugar, no cream. His tie was crooked. I didn't fix it. He left before me, the front door closing softly behind him. No kiss, no goodbye. Just the sound of absence. And then I was alone, standing in the kitchen with my hand still resting on the counter, as if bracing myself for an impact that had already come. At the office, I arrived earlier than usual. I wasn't sure why. Maybe I thought the emptiness would give me space to breathe. Or maybe I was hoping to avoid him. I didn't even know if he would be there. After the night in the hotel, after waking up to silence, I hadn't heard from him, not a word, not a glance. I hadn't expected one. But part of me had waited anyway. His desk was empty when I arrived. I turned on my computer, sorted through emails, approved time-off requests. I stayed busy. Or at least, I made myself look busy. Every time the elevator dinged, I looked up instinctively, then looked back down again before the doors opened. My hands were steady. My heart wasn't. When he finally walked in, nearly an hour late, he looked the same as always. Calm. Focused. Professional. He avoided eye contact, walked directly to his desk, and began working. I said nothing. Neither did he. There was no acknowledgement of anything that had happened between us. No tension. No awkwardness. Just quiet resignation. I told myself it was better this way. Throughout the day, we barely crossed paths. We communicated through email, passed files without touching, spoke only when necessary and in tones stripped of anything resembling emotion. It was the kind of professionalism people admired. Clean. Efficient. Controlled. But underneath it all, I felt the echo of something undone. Around lunchtime, I stepped outside for air. I walked the block twice, not really going anywhere, just trying to untangle the thoughts crowding my head. My phone vibrated once, an email reminder for an upcoming client call. Nothing personal. Nothing that would stop my breath or send adrenaline racing through my body. Just life, marching forward. Back inside, I resumed the call, took notes, gave input. My voice was steady. My posture composed. No one would have guessed that anything inside me had shifted. But I could feel it, the subtle dislocation of something deep, like a joint pulled just slightly out of socket. It didn't break. But it hurt when I moved. By the end of the day, the office had returned to its usual rhythm. People laughed in corners, packed their bags, asked about weekend plans. I kept my head down, responding with polite nods and short answers. I didn't want to explain why I looked tired. Or distracted. Or why my voice seemed quieter than usual. As I gathered my things to leave, I noticed something tucked beneath my keyboard. A folded sheet of paper. I didn't recognize the handwriting immediately, but as I opened it, my chest tightened. It wasn't long, just 2 short lines. I'm leaving at the end of the week. I thought you should know. No signature. None needed. I sat down slowly, holding the paper in my lap. My first reaction wasn't panic. Or sadness. It was stillness. Like standing in the eye of a storm, knowing the winds would return any second. I didn't know if he had made this decision before or after the night in the hotel. I didn't know if it was personal or professional. But it didn't matter. The effect was the same. A clean break. A quiet exit. No confrontation. No explanation. Just silence, once again doing the job of words. When I got home that night, my husband was already there, sitting at the kitchen table with his laptop open and a half-finished sandwich beside him. He looked up briefly when I entered, offered a smile that didn't quite land. "Hey," he said. "Everything okay?" "Yes," I replied. I hung my coat, placed my bag down, and moved through the house like I belonged to it again. He closed the laptop after a moment. "I was thinking, maybe we could try that weekend away after all. There's a cabin not too far upstate. Quiet. Might be good for us." I nodded slowly. "Maybe." He took that as agreement and began looking up dates on his phone. I watched him, the lines on his forehead deeper than I remembered. He wasn't a bad man. Just tired. Detached. Like me. We had both drifted so far from each other that now, even our attempts at reconnection felt like diplomacy rather than affection. I excused myself early and went upstairs. My room was neat. Almost sterile. I changed into pajamas, turned down the bed, and sat with the lights off for a while. My phone sat face down on the nightstand. I didn't reach for it. I thought about the note. About how final it felt. About how little space there was left for questions. I tried to picture the office without him. It wasn't difficult. He had entered my life quietly, and he would leave the same way. No one else would notice the vacancy he left behind. Only me. I wondered if he'd say goodbye. Or if he already had. Eventually, I lay down and closed my eyes, the weight of everything I hadn't said pressing down on my chest. I didn't cry. I didn't think I had anything left to release. Just the dull ache of something unfinished. And the realization that I would have to carry it alone. In the silence, I listened to the wind outside and tried to convince myself that this was the right thing. That sometimes, letting go was the only way to protect what was left of yourself. But even as I repeated it like a mantra, I didn't believe it. Not really. The office was quieter than usual on Thursday. Perhaps it was the cloudy sky, or the knowledge that the week was nearly over. Or perhaps I had simply tuned out the background noise so completely that it no longer registered. My desk looked exactly the same as it had for years, stacked with carefully labeled folders, a pen holder, the usual coffee cup with a faint chip near the rim. Everything was in its place. Everything on the outside remained unchanged. But I was different. He wasn't at his desk that morning. I told myself not to look. Told myself it didn't matter. But I looked anyway. The chair was empty. A few papers remained stacked neatly. His computer was still there, shut down. No personal items. No trace of anything that felt like him. Just work. That's all we had been allowed to be, in the end, colleagues again. I went about my tasks slowly, carefully. I reread an internal memo twice before forwarding it. I spent 15 minutes adjusting a spreadsheet that had been fine the first time. I kept glancing at the clock, each minute ticking forward with mechanical precision. He hadn't arrived by mid-morning. And by noon, I knew he wouldn't come in again. I found myself standing at the window near the break room, watching the street below. People walked with purpose, umbrellas tucked under arms, phones in hand. There was a kind of certainty to their movements that felt foreign to me. I had spent so many weeks living in the in-between, between choices, between truths, that I barely remembered what decisive action looked like anymore. At some point in the afternoon, one of the HR coordinators came by with a clipboard. She handed me a clearance form with his name at the top and a gentle smile. He asked that you approve his final documentation, she said. Said you'd understand. I nodded. Yes. Of course. She left without asking anything more, her eyes kind but careful. I sat down at my desk and stared at the paper in front of me. Final documentation. As if this were any other resignation. Just another transfer. Another quiet exit. But this wasn't routine. At least not for me. The form was brief. Dates, signatures, asset returns. His desk had already been cleared. He'd sent in a forwarding email address. There was no personal note attached, no explanation. Only the formalities. But even so, as I signed the bottom line, I felt something in my chest give way. Not a break. A release. Like finally letting go of something that had been held too tightly for too long. I returned the form without comment. No one asked questions. No one lingered. By the end of the day, his name was already removed from the internal calendar. At home, my husband was preparing for the weekend. He printed maps, booked reservations, called ahead to the cabin rental office. He was trying. I saw that. And I didn't resent it. Not anymore. His effort, however late, was still something. But it didn't move me. We ate dinner together, talked about road conditions, grocery lists, whether to bring books or games. He asked if I wanted to hike. I said maybe. He didn't notice my hesitation. Or if he did, he didn't question it. He wanted this weekend to feel like progress. A step forward. Something to circle on the calendar and say, we tried. Later, as I folded clothes into a weekend bag, I realized how empty the gesture felt. It wasn't sadness. It wasn't numbness. It was something quieter, acceptance, perhaps. The kind that arrives not in dramatic waves, but in the gentle way you stop checking your phone for a message you know won't come. That night, as he slept beside me, I retrieved the 2 folded notes from the back of my drawer. I didn't read them again. I just held them. Their presence reminded me that I hadn't imagined it. That something real had lived in the silence. Something unspeakable. And perhaps something that was never meant to last. The next morning, we left for the cabin. The drive was long and uneventful. We talked about mundane things, traffic, radio stations, how the weather might turn. The trees lining the highway were beginning to shift color. The first signs of autumn creeping in. He reached for my hand at one point, gave it a soft squeeze. I let him. The cabin was small but comfortable. A wood-burning stove, worn rugs, windows overlooking a quiet lake. He unpacked quickly, eager to settle in. I stood near the window, watching the water shift with the wind. The stillness of it was almost too much. I felt like I might dissolve inside it. That evening, we sat outside under a blanket, watching the sky fade into a dull navy. He spoke about us, about how he wanted to fix things, how he knew he hadn't been present. He apologized. Not dramatically. Not eloquently. But sincerely. I listened. And I didn't interrupt. When he finished, I said, "Thank you." It was all I could offer. He looked at me, searching for something in my face. I didn't hide from him. But I didn't give him what he wanted either. Not yet. That night, I lay in bed beside him, eyes open to the wooden ceiling above. The room smelled of smoke and pine. I thought about how strange it was to be physically close to someone and still feel apart. We weren't fighting. We weren't cold. We were just unfinished. The next morning, I rose before sunrise and stepped outside. The air was sharp, biting at my cheeks. Mist curled along the edge of the lake. I sat on the steps of the cabin, wrapped in a sweater, and let the cold ground me. I didn't know what would happen when we returned. I didn't know what I wanted, not fully. But I knew one thing clearly now: I had stopped pretending. The space inside me that had been filled with confusion was now just space, empty, open, waiting. And that, somehow, felt like the beginning of something. Even if I didn't yet know what. Coming back from the cabin felt like returning from a dream I hadn't truly entered. The trees lining the highway were the same, the gas stations, the exits, the inevitable grayness of Sunday traffic. Everything looked familiar, unchanged. But I felt removed from all of it, as if I had been observing the world through a window that wouldn't open. My husband kept the radio low. We spoke little, mostly about restocking the fridge or whether to order takeout that evening. He seemed satisfied with how the weekend had gone, as if the simple act of retreating together had reset something essential. I didn't correct him. I didn't confirm it either. I offered nods, quiet affirmations. I let him build the version of reality he needed. It wasn't my place anymore to dismantle it. The house welcomed us with stillness. The same dim lighting, the same scent of old wood and laundry detergent. I unpacked our bags, folded the sweaters we never wore, put away toiletries as though nothing had changed. My hands moved automatically. Each drawer I closed felt like sealing a decision I hadn't said aloud yet. That night, after we ate in near silence, he kissed my forehead and went upstairs. I stayed in the kitchen, rinsing dishes we hadn't used. My fingers stayed under the warm water longer than necessary. I dried them slowly, then wandered to the living room and sat down in the dark. I didn't turn on the lamp. I didn't need the light. On the coffee table sat a stack of unopened mail. Bills, catalogs, postcards from places we never visited. One envelope bore my name in careful print, no return address. I opened it without thinking, my hand steady, my breath held. Inside was a short note. Handwritten. Unmistakable. I won't reach out again. Thank you for seeing me when I needed to be seen. No signature. No date. Just that. I folded it slowly and placed it back inside the envelope, then tucked it into the drawer where I kept the others. 3 pieces of paper. 3 versions of the truth. Together they told a story that no one else would ever read. The next morning, I woke before my alarm. The sun hadn't risen yet. I sat at the edge of the bed and stared at the floor for a long time before standing. My husband stirred beside me, murmured something incoherent, then settled again. I moved quietly, dressing with care, choosing a blouse I hadn't worn in months. Something in a soft cream. Simple. Clean. At work, the office felt both hollow and overwhelming. His desk was empty, as expected. A new employee had been seated there, someone young, energetic, unaware of the story that desk held. I didn't ask his name. I didn't introduce myself. I went to my office, closed the door gently, and sat in silence. The hours passed. Emails, meetings, updates. The world kept turning, and I kept moving with it. By midday, I found myself walking into the break room, standing before the same coffee machine, holding the same paper cup. A colleague passed behind me and made a comment about the weather. I smiled, replied, moved on. No one knew anything had changed. That evening, after dinner, my husband suggested a movie. I declined. Said I had some things to finish up. He didn't push. He went upstairs, and I sat at the kitchen table with my laptop open but untouched. Eventually, I closed the screen and picked up a pen. I pulled a blank note card from the drawer. No letterhead. No flourish. Just white space. I began to write. Slowly. Deliberately. I hope you find what you're looking for. Whatever it is, I hope it feels honest. I didn't sign it. I didn't seal it. I didn't intend to send it. I just wrote it. Then I folded it once and placed it next to the others. It didn't belong to anyone else, but I needed to give the words a place to exist. The next weekend, I went to the market alone. I took the long way home, driving through streets I hadn't visited in years. I stopped near the old bookstore on the corner, parked without thinking, and stepped inside. It smelled the same aged paper, worn wood, the faint musk of old carpet. I wandered the aisles slowly, not looking for anything in particular. A woman at the counter was telling the clerk about a poetry reading happening the following Thursday. I listened, intrigued. I used to go to those, years ago. Before all of this. Before I forgot I could sit quietly and listen to someone else's words and feel something that belonged only to me. Back at home, my husband was in the garage, organizing tools. He greeted me with a smile. I nodded. There was a peace between us now, not born of passion or reconciliation, but of resignation. We were no longer pretending to be what we weren't. That, in its own way, was a kind of mercy. That evening, I opened a drawer in the hallway where we kept old photo albums. I sat cross-legged on the floor and flipped through one slowly. Our wedding. A beach trip. An anniversary dinner from a decade ago. I studied our faces. We looked so certain back then. So sure of who we were, and who we would remain. I closed the album gently, placed it back in the drawer, and stood up. That night, as I stood by the window in our bedroom, watching the light fade from the sky, I realized something that I hadn't been ready to admit until now. I wasn't waiting anymore. Not for an apology. Not for a message. Not even for clarity. I had made mistakes. I had crossed lines. I had stood too long in places I should have walked away from. But I had also found a version of myself I thought I'd lost. A quieter version. A woman who no longer needed anyone to tell her who she was. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was mine.